The doctor is terrified to operate on a patient who looks just like him. Hello, everyone. Enjoy these relaxing moments while you watch. Los Angeles, 2345. In the operating room of Los Angeles General Hospital, the blinding surgical lights shone down on the tense face of Dr. Alexander Carter. On the operating table lay a patient in critical condition, their heart nearly stopped. "Prepare the anesthetic," Alexander ordered, his voice urgent yet retaining its usual professionalism. Nurse Emma Evans, a middle-aged woman with over 20 years of experience, reacted immediately. "What dosage, doctor?" 30 milligrams of propofol. Monitor the heart rate. We need to hurry." Emma nodded, but her eyes betrayed deep concern. "I've never seen a case like this. No family, no clear identity, and all their data blocked in the hospital system." Alexander didn't have time to dwell on that now. He leaned forward, his hand gripping the scalpel tightly. But as he glanced at the screen displaying the patient's file, he froze. The patient on the table had a face identical to his own. Every feature, the deep brown eyes, the small scar on the forehead, even the faint blue veins beneath the pale skin, was like a mirror image of Alexander. "What the hell is this?" he muttered, his heart pounding. Emma frowned as she noticed the change in Alexander's expression. "Doctor, is something wrong?" Alexander took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. "No, it's nothing. Let's proceed." But in his mind, a flood of questions surged. How could someone look exactly like him? The patient's DNA, why did it match his own? He glanced at Dr. Stephen Parker, who had been in charge of the surgery, before handing it over to him. Stephen stood with his arms crossed, his gaze carrying a cryptic intent, as if waiting for Alexander's reaction. "Dr. Carter, is there a problem?" Stephen asked, his tone laced with a hint of amusement. Alexander clenched his jaw. "This patient, who is he really?" Stephen smiled. "Just focus on the surgery. A heart transplant isn't a simple matter." Alexander stared at Stephen, a growing unease tightening his chest. "I want to know who he is." Stephen shrugged, but a dangerous glint flickered in his eyes. "Someone not worth your concern." Stephen's response only deepened Alexander's suspicions. After the surgery was delayed, Alexander returned to his office, booted up his computer, and began searching for information about the mysterious patient. But all the data was encrypted. Emma walked in, carrying a cup of coffee. "You still haven't gone home." "I can't. I need to figure out who this patient is." She set the coffee down and crossed her arms. "Do you think this isn't a normal surgery?" Alexander nodded. "Not just abnormal, it's completely illogical." He continued typing commands to access the data. The screen flickered for a few seconds before displaying basic information. Name, redacted. Age, 38. Condition, severe trauma, requires heart transplant. Medical history, redacted. Family, none. Emma stared at the screen. "I've never seen a patient file so thoroughly erased like this. It's as if someone wants to hide his true identity." Alexander frowned. "An unidentified patient with DNA identical to mine and all information concealed." Emma glanced at him, her voice grave. "Have you ever considered that he might be you?" Alexander flinched. "What do you mean?" The nurse lowered her voice. "I don't know, but clearly something is very wrong here." Alexander turned back to the screen, a wave of unease spreading through his body. If this man was truly him, then who was he? The next morning, Alexander entered the hospital with a troubled mind. But as he approached the patient ward, he noticed two men in black suits standing guard at the door. Alexander frowned. "Who are they?" Emma shook her head. "I don't know either. They showed up early this morning." Alexander stepped closer, but one of the men raised a hand to stop him. "Sorry, doctor, you're not allowed in. I'm the doctor in charge of this patient. I have the right to enter." The man shook his head. "Orders from above. No one can approach the patient without permission." Alexander clenched his fists. "From whom?" "That information doesn't concern you." Frustrated, Alexander turned to walk away, but his mind raced. Why would a patient need guards? Suddenly, a faint, weak voice came from inside the room. "Alexander, help me!" He spun around, his heart pounding. "What?" But the man in the black suit pushed him back. "You didn't hear anything. Leave." A chill ran down Alexander's spine. The patient had just called his name. That evening, as Alexander prepared to leave the hospital, Stephen appeared at his office door. "Dr. Carter, Stephen said in a low voice. I'd advise you not to get too curious about that patient. Alexander crossed his arms. Then tell me the truth. Stephen chuckled. The truth? There are some truths you shouldn't know. Oh, really? Like the fact that the patient has DNA identical to mine, that his file's been completely wiped, that he just called my name from the room. The smile faded from Stephen's lips. You really don't know who you are, do you? Alexander froze. What did you say? Stephen stepped closer, whispering, If I were you, I wouldn't dig any deeper. Otherwise, you might regret it. Alexander watched Stephen walk away, a vague sense of dread rising within him. Who was he, really? Alexander couldn't sleep. His conversation with Stephen echoed in his mind. You really don't know who you are, do you? Those words cut into his thoughts like a knife. He knew something was wrong. Something about himself felt off. The next morning, Alexander returned to the hospital earlier than usual. But as he stepped into his office, a sight made him freeze. All records related to the mysterious patient had been completely erased from the system. He frantically opened his computer and accessed the hospital's database. But as he entered the search command, the screen displayed a cold message. Access denied. Error code 403. Alexander gritted his teeth. This can't be. Just then, the door to his office burst open. Emma rushed in, her face pale. What's wrong? Alexander asked. The nurse gasped for breath. The patient, he's gone. Alexander went still. What? They took him. I saw two men in suits wheeling his bed out of the room. When I asked, they just said it was request from above. Alexander grabbed his lab coat and raced down the hospital corridor, but when he reached the patient's room, it was completely empty. The bed was pristine, not a single trace remained of anyone ever being there. This can't be, Alexander whispered. Emma shook her head. They did it too fast. It's like he never existed. Alexander clenched his fists. I won't let this end like this. Determined to uncover the truth, Alexander drove to the hospital's records office. If the patient's data had been erased from the system, perhaps the paper files still remained. Stepping into the office, he saw Dr. Michael Clark, the head of records, organizing a stack of papers. Michael looked up. Dr. Carter, looking for something. I need to see the file of the patient admitted yesterday, the severe trauma case. Michael frowned. Oh, I remember that one. But someone came this morning and took all the related documents. Alexander froze. Who? I don't know. Just someone with orders from the highest level of the hospital. Alexander tried to stay calm. Do you remember anything about that patient? A name? An address? Even a small clue? Michael hesitated for a moment, then lowered his voice. They told me to erase all the data, but I have a habit of keeping a backup. Alexander's heart raced. You still have a copy. Michael glanced around, then pulled a thin file from his drawer and handed it to Alexander. It's just one page. I didn't have time to back up the rest. Alexander flipped through it quickly. There was only a single name scrawled messily. Project Genesis. He frowned. Project Genesis. Michael nodded. I don't know what it means, but it seems like that patient was tied to something much bigger than a typical trauma case. Alexander gripped the paper tightly. Genesis? What was it? That night, Alexander returned home with a flood of questions in his mind. He tossed his coat onto the chair, opened a bottle of whiskey, and poured a full glass. But as he took his first sip, an excruciating headache hit him. You really don't know who you are, do you? We can coexist. Project Genesis. Voices echoed in his head, accompanied by fragmented images, blood, syringes, a stark white room, people with faces identical to his own. Alexander staggered, clutching his head. No, he screamed. And then, his body collapsed. Everything went black. Alexander woke when a cold hand touched his forehead. Opening his eyes, he saw a woman in a white lab coat, her deep brown eyes studying him intently. You're awake, she said softly. Alexander tried to sit up, but his head still spun. Who are you? The woman glanced around, then whispered, "On Claire Miller, a nurse at Los Angeles General Hospital." Alexander frowned. What are you doing here? Claire stared at him. I came to warn you. If you keep investigating, you'll disappear like everyone else who's ever asked questions about Genesis. Alexander sat up straight, his heart pounding. You know about Genesis. Claire nodded. I can't say much here, but I have this. She pulled a small USB drive from her pocket and handed it to Alexander. "There's information in here that you need, but be careful, they're watching you." Alexander looked at Claire, a bad feeling rising within him. Who are they? Claire took a deep breath. The Genesis Council, an organization behind all the human cloning surgeries. Alexander froze. What? Claire looked at him, her eyes full of worry. "I know you don't believe me, but look at the data on that USB. Then decide if you want to run or keep searching for the truth." Alexander gripped the USB tightly in his hand. He knew he couldn't stop. Alexander sat in front of his computer, clutching the USB Claire had given him. His mind still couldn't process everything that had happened. The Genesis Council, an organization behind human cloning surgeries. The thought sent a chill down his spine. Without hesitating any longer, he plugged the USB into his computer. A single folder appeared on the screen, Top Secret Genesis Project. Alexander's heart pounded. He opened the folder, and a series of documents popped up. Document number 1. Project name, Genesis. Objective, human recreation through cloning technology. Founder, redacted. First experiment, redacted. Document number 2. Test subjects. Specimen GV001, success. Missing. Specimen GV002, success. Terminated. Specimen GV003, currently under control. Alexander's eyes widened. GV003. He scrolled to the bottom of the document and nearly stopped breathing when he read the final line. GV003 equals Alexander Carter. Alexander shoved his chair back, his heart racing uncontrollably. "I am a clone. No way. This had to be a joke. A misunderstanding." He gasped for air, trying to control the rising panic. But Stephen's voice echoed in his head. "You really don't know who you are, do you? They're watching you." His hand clenched into a fist and slammed down on the desk. No, he didn't believe it, or he couldn't believe it. But before he could think further, his phone rang. Caller ID, Claire Miller. Alexander quickly picked up. "Claire, you have to run now." Her voice was frantic. "They know you have the USB. They're coming." Alexander's entire body tensed. "Who are they?" "They'll kill you, Alexander," Claire screamed. "Get out of the house right now." At that moment, the lights in his house went out. Alexander dashed to the window and peeked through the blinds. Outside, 2 black cars were parked right in front of his house. 3 men in black stepped out. One pulled out a phone, seemingly talking to someone. Alexander didn't need to guess. They were here for him. He bolted to his desk, yanked the USB from the computer, and stuffed it into his pocket. "Calm down, calm down." A loud banging erupted at the door. "Dr. Carter, open the door now." Alexander stepped back, his heart pounding. Damn it. There was no time left. He darted into the kitchen and opened the back door, but boom, the front door was kicked open. Alexander didn't have time to think. He ran. Heavy footsteps thundered behind him. "Alexander, stop. No way in hell." He bolted down the alley behind the apartment complex, his heart hammering wildly in his chest. The sound of pursuing footsteps grew closer. A gunshot rang out. Pang. The bullet grazed Alexander's shoulder. He hissed in pain but didn't stop. Ahead was a main road, if he could just reach it. Suddenly, a car screeched to a halt right in front of him. The door flung open. Inside, Claire sat in the driver's seat, shouting, "Get in now." Alexander didn't hesitate. He leapt into the car, and Claire floored the gas pedal. The car sped off just as his pursuers reached the spot. Both of them panted heavily inside the vehicle. Alexander clutched his shoulder, blood seeping through his shirt. Claire glanced at him. "Are you okay?" He nodded, but in truth, he was anything but okay. "Claire, who am I?" His voice trembled. "They called me GV003. What does that mean?" Claire gripped the steering wheel tightly. "You're one of Genesis's most successful experiments. A perfect clone. But they never wanted you to know that." Alexander shook his head. "No way. I have memories. I have my own life." Claire cut him off. "Those memories aren't yours." Alexander's heart clenched. "What?" "They were implanted in you. What you think is your childhood, your family, it's all fake." Alexander felt like he couldn't breathe. He wanted to argue. but deep down he knew she was telling the truth. Claire drove to an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city. Inside, a man was waiting, Dr. James Mitchell, a former doctor who once worked at Los Angeles General Hospital. James looked at Alexander, his gaze heavy. "So you finally know." Alexander frowned. "Who are you?" James sighed. "A fugitive, just like you," Claire interrupted. "We don't have much time. The Genesis Council won't stop until they have Alexander back." Alexander clenched his fists. "I won't let them take me, but I need to know the whole truth." James nodded. "Then you'd better brace yourself, because this truth might be more horrifying than you can imagine." Inside the abandoned warehouse, the dim yellow light cast shadows on the peeling walls, creating a gloomy and oppressive atmosphere. Alexander sat across from Dr. James Mitchell, a man with dark circles under his eyes from sleeplessness, while Claire Miller leaned against the wall, her gaze alert. "Tell me now," Alexander said, clenching his fists and staring at James. "Who am I, really?" James sighed, pulling an old file from his coat pocket and flipping to the first page. "Project Genesis. Test subject GV003. Alexander gritted his teeth. "Genesis again. You've already realized you're not a normal human, haven't you?" James said in a low voice. "But I bet you still don't understand the full story." Alexander nodded, his eyes darkening. "I need to know everything." James took a deep breath. Project Genesis was launched over 30 years ago. A group of top scientists was funded to research human cloning technology. He pushed the file toward Alexander. "You're a product of that project." Alexander opened the file. Faded photographs appeared before his eyes, images of himself at different stages. There was one photo of a version of him locked inside a containment tank. Alexander felt a chill run through his entire body. "This is..." James nodded. "Those were the earlier clones of you, but they all failed." Alexander stared deeply at the photo. A man with a face identical to his own, but with lifeless, empty eyes. "So, I'm one of them." James shook his head. "No, you're the most complete version. They called you GV003 because you were the first clone capable of living like a real human." Alexander swallowed hard. "What about GV001 and GV002? Claire answered, her voice dropping low. GV-1 escaped, but was never found. GV002 was terminated due to genetic defects." Alexander trembled. "GV001 could still be alive." James frowned. "Possibly. But the Genesis Council has been hunting him for years with no trace." Alexander fell silent. Another clone of himself could be out there. Claire stepped forward, her voice urgent. "We don't have much time. The Genesis Council never lets traitors go." James nodded. "You need to know that you're being tracked. Everything you do, they know." Alexander let out a bitter laugh. "I don't have anything left to lose." James shook his head. "You're wrong. You still have your life." Claire cut in. "We need to get out of here now. Otherwise, we'll never have a chance to learn more of the truth." Alexander clenched his fists. "So where do we go?" James slid a piece of paper with an address written on it toward him. "There's a place, an old Genesis lab. If there's any clue about GV001, it'll be there." Alexander looked at the paper, his heart filled with unease. The three of them drove to an abandoned industrial area on the outskirts of Los Angeles. The sky was pitch black, with only the faint flicker of streetlights. Claire lowered her voice. "We have to be careful. If this place is still being monitored..." James nodded. "We won't get a second chance." Alexander gazed at the dilapidated building in front of them. The Genesis laboratory. They stepped inside. The smell of mold and old metal hit their noses. James turned on a flashlight, illuminating the stained walls. "Follow me." They moved along a long corridor, heading toward a door with a warning sign. "Restricted area, authorized personnel only." Claire glanced at Alexander. "Are you sure you want to do this?" Alexander tightened his fists. "I don't have a way back." James crouched down, using a set of tools to pick the lock. A click sounded, and the door swung open. They stepped inside, and then Alexander froze in place. Inside the room were dozens of glass tanks, each containing a human body, all with faces identical to his own. Alexander stepped back, his breathing ragged. This can't be." James looked at him, his voice serious. You're one of them, Alexander, but you're the only one who survived. Alexander felt the world around him shatter. So I'm really just an experiment. His voice cracked. Claire placed a hand on his shoulder. You're not just an experiment. You're proof that Genesis succeeded. Alexander turned to James, his eyes blazing with anger. Then why do they want to kill me? James shrugged. Because you know too much, and because you're no longer under their control. Alexander clenched his fists. I won't let them dictate my fate. James nodded. Good, but if you want to fight back, you have to be ready to face even more horrifying truths. Alexander stared deeply into the tanks. How many versions of him had existed? How many had been killed just for being defective clones? A surge of rage welled up inside him. The Genesis Council, they would pay. Alexander stood frozen in the lab, surrounded by tanks filled with copies of himself. Dozens, maybe hundreds, of identical faces, lifeless, floating in artificial fluid. Each face was a failed entity, individuals who never got to live a real life. He couldn't tear his eyes away. Was he just one of them? Claire touched his shoulder lightly. Alexander, we don't have time. We need to leave before they find us. But Alexander didn't move. His breathing grew erratic. Everything he'd ever believed about himself, it was all a lie. James looked at him, his tone grave. I know how you feel, but if you want to survive, you have to accept this. You're not the first, but you could be the last. Alexander clenched his fists. If I'm not the first, then where's GV001? James hesitated for a moment, then sighed. No one knows. If he's still alive, he escaped long ago. Claire interjected. The real question is, what are you going to do now? Alexander looked up, his eyes flashing with resolve. I'm done running. As the three of them left the lab, the air outside grew thick with an invisible sense of danger. James glanced around. Something's off. We need to go now. They ran toward the exit, but just as the door swung open, 4 men in black suits stood blocking their path. A cold voice spoke. Hello, Dr. Carter. Alexander instantly recognized the speaker, Stephen Parker. Stephen stepped forward, his eyes glinting with amusement. You've dug a little too deep, Alexander. Alexander clenched his fists. Why? Why create me if you plan to kill me from the start? Stephen smirked. We didn't create you to ask questions. You're a product, a lab rat. And you've gone too far. Alexander gritted his teeth. I'm not a lab rat. Stephen shook his head and signaled his men. Unfortunately, we can't let you keep existing. 2 of the men in black drew their guns. Claire shouted, Run! Alexander lunged toward a row of metal shelves and shoved them hard, sending them crashing down with a loud bang. Gunshots rang out. Pang! Pang! James pulled Claire down to hide behind a wooden crate. Alexander, we can't fight them head on. Alexander gritted his teeth, his heart pounding wildly. Do we have any other choice? Stephen yelled. Carter! Don't waste your time. You can't escape. Alexander scanned the room. There was an exit in the back, but it was blocked by 2 men in black. He tightened his fists. No way out, Claire panted. I've got a smoke grenade in my bag. If we use it, we might get away. James nodded. Do it. Claire pulled out the grenade, yanked the pin, and hurled it toward Stephen. Boom. White smoke filled the room. Run. The 3 of them bolted through the haze, desperately searching for an escape. But pang! A bullet grazed Alexander's arm. He gritted his teeth but didn't stop. The emergency exit loomed ahead. They burst through it, running out into an empty lot. James shouted, Where's the car? Claire pulled out the keys and pressed the remote. A car not far away flashed its lights. The 3 of them piled into the vehicle. Claire slammed on the gas, and the car sped off. Alexander panted, blood from his arm dripping onto the seat. Claire glanced at him through the rearview mirror. You okay? He nodded, but in reality he wasn't okay at all. James gripped the steering wheel tightly. They won't stop. We have to disappear before they find us. Claire mused. There's a place. An abandoned medical outpost off the radar. Alexander frowned. We can't keep running forever. James turned to him. Got any better ideas? Alexander fell silent. He couldn't keep fleeing. But he wasn't strong enough to fight back yet either. When they reached the hideout, Claire bandaged Alexander's wound. James unfolded a map and pointed to a spot. This is Genesis's main headquarters. If we want to end this, we have to go there. Alexander frowned. You want to break into their headquarters? James nodded. Not just break in. We'll destroy it. Claire shook her head. You're insane. There's only 3 of us. Alexander smirked. Maybe not just 3. James and Claire turned to look at him. Alexander took a deep breath. I'll find GV001. If he's still alive, he'll help us. Claire froze. You want to find a clone that's been missing for over 20 years? Alexander nodded. If anyone understands me, it's him. The car rolled down a pitch-black road, its headlights slicing through the thick darkness. Inside, no one spoke a word. James broke the silence first. I still don't believe you're serious about finding GV001. Claire glanced at Alexander through the rearview mirror. You don't even know where he is, or if he really exists. Alexander stared out the window, his voice low. If he's alive, I'll find him. James crossed his arms, thinking for a moment before speaking. If GV001 is real, there's only one place he could have hidden. Claire raised an eyebrow. Where? Alexander. James looked at Alexander. The slums in South Central. If he escaped Genesis, that's where he could lay low. Alexander nodded. Then that's where we're going. 2 hours later, they arrived at the slums on the edge of Los Angeles. The area was steeped in darkness, filled with crumbling buildings and narrow streets littered with trash. James muttered, "This isn't a place for the faint of heart." Claire glanced at Alexander. "You sure he's here?" Alexander wasn't certain, but deep down he had a feeling the man was still alive. They walked cautiously through a narrow alley, the stench of garbage and stagnant water assaulting their senses. Suddenly, a voice spoke from the shadows. "Who are you looking for?" Alexander spun around. A man about 40 years old stood there, disheveled hair, scruffy beard, a gaunt face but sharp, piercing eyes. He stared at Alexander, then whispered, "No way." Alexander clenched his fists. "Are you GV001? The man let out a dry, raspy laugh. GV001 died a long time ago. They sat in a small room, the dim light flickering. GV001 took a drag from his cigarette, his eyes heavy with exhaustion. "I used to be GV001, but now I'm just Daniel Clark." Alexander looked straight into his eyes. "How did you escape Genesis?" Daniel gave a faint smile. "I didn't escape. I was abandoned. When they realized I wasn't perfect, they wanted to dispose of me. But I got away." James cut in. "Why didn't you try to destroy Genesis?" Daniel laughed bitterly. "You think I didn't want to? I tried. But they're stronger than you can imagine." Alexander narrowed his eyes. "Do you want revenge?" Daniel stubbed out his cigarette, his voice dropping low. "I thought I could forget it all, but if you're serious about ending Genesis." He locked eyes with Alexander. "I'll help you." In the dimly lit room, the 4 of them sat around an old table, a map of Genesis's headquarters spread out before them. James pointed to a spot. "We need to break into the central research area. If there's any data on Genesis, it'll be there." Claire nodded. "But how do we get in? Security there isn't a joke." Daniel crossed his arms. "We'll need a plan and a traitor on the inside." Alexander narrowed his eyes. "What do you mean?" Daniel smirked. "Stephen Parker. He's not as loyal to Genesis as you think." James flinched. "You sure about that?" Daniel nodded. "I've been watching him for years. He's only loyal to power. If we give him a big enough reason to betray Genesis." Alexander smirked. "Then we'll make him turn." 2 days later, Alexander walked into a small bar where Stephen was known to hang out. He was sitting alone in a corner, a glass of whiskey in hand. Alexander approached. "Hello, Dr. Parker." Stephen startled, then smirked. "I thought you were in hiding." Alexander pulled out a chair and sat down, locking eyes with him. "I have an offer." Stephen scoffed. "An offer?" Alexander lowered his voice. "Do you want to keep being Genesis as loyal dog, or do you want to take control of the game yourself?" Stephen went quiet, a sharp glint flashing in his eyes. Alexander pressed on. "I know you're not truly loyal to them. You're just waiting for the right opportunity, aren't you?" Stephen took a sip of his whiskey, then chuckled. "You're clever, Carter, but what guarantees I won't betray you right now?" Alexander smiled. "Because I have something you need." He slid an envelope across the table toward Stephen. Stephen opened it, and his expression changed instantly. He looked at Alexander, his voice low. "Where did you get this?" Alexander shrugged. "I have my ways, and I can get more if you cooperate." Stephen stared at him for a long moment. Then he nodded. "Fine. We have a deal." Alexander left the bar and stepped into the waiting car. Claire looked at him through the rearview mirror. Did he agree? Alexander nodded. He agreed. Daniel smirked. "Then it's time to end Genesis." James gripped the steering wheel tightly. "Once we start, there's no turning back." Alexander stared out the window, his eyes blazing with fierce determination. "We don't need a way back." It was nearly dawn. In the abandoned warehouse, a faint light flickered on the table, where a detailed map of Genesis's headquarters was spread out. Alexander, Claire, James, and Daniel sat around it, planning the most dangerous break-in of their lives. James pointed to a spot on the map. "Genesis's data center is in the 3rd basement level. If we can get in there and download all the experiment-related data, we can expose the whole truth." Claire nodded. "But security there is incredibly tight. Even with Stephen helping from the inside, we can't just waltz in." Alexander clenched his fists. "We don't need to get in the easy way. We'll make them open the door for us." Daniel smirked. "What do you mean?" Alexander took a deep breath. "I'll let them capture me." Everyone froze. Claire immediately objected. "Are you insane? If they catch you, you'll never get out." James nodded. "They might kill you the moment they see your face." Alexander looked at all of them, his gaze unwavering. "No, they won't. They need me. I'm GV003, the most perfect clone. They won't kill me right away. And while they're bringing me into the headquarters, you guys can sneak in from the West Wing, where Stephen has cleared a path." Claire bit her lip, still unable to accept it. "This plan is too dangerous." Daniel stared at Alexander for a long moment, then burst out laughing. "You're absolutely crazy." "But I like this plan." Alexander nodded. "Then let's get started." 3 hours later, Alexander stood alone in the middle of an empty street, waiting for Stephen to arrive. A black car pulled up, and the window rolled down. Stephen sat in the driver's seat, his eyes narrowing. "You sure about this?" Alexander nodded. "Tell your superiors I've decided to surrender." Stephen studied him for a moment, then smirked. "You really are different from the clones before you. They only knew how to run, but you're walking straight into the tiger's den." Alexander said nothing. He knew he had no way back. The car door opened. "Get in." He stepped inside, and the door slammed shut behind him. The car drove for nearly an hour before stopping in front of Genesis's headquarters, a modern, cold building with no windows, no signs of light. Alexander stepped out of the car, and 2 guards immediately bound his hands with electronic cuffs. A deep voice sounded from behind him. "Welcome home, GV003. Alexander turned and saw Henry Richards, one of the highest-ranking members of the Genesis Council. He was a middle-aged man with sharp, icy eyes and a dangerous smile. Henry stepped closer, examining Alexander like a scientist studying a lab rat. "We thought you'd run like the clones before you, but no, you came back on your own." Alexander locked eyes with him. "I want an answer." Henry raised an eyebrow. "Oh, about what?" Alexander gritted his teeth. "I'm done being a puppet. I want to know why I was created." Henry laughed. "An interesting question. Fine, since you've returned willingly, I'll tell you." Alexander was escorted through the frigid hallways of Genesis's headquarters. Finally, he was led into a vast laboratory where rows of screens displayed complex data. Henry walked over to one of the screens and entered a code. A video began to play. On the screen, a middle-aged man appeared, a man with a face identical to Alexander's, but older. Alexander's heart seemed to stop. The man in the video started speaking. "I am Dr. Alexander Carter, the original. If you're watching this video, it means I'm already dead. Genesis cloned me to continue my work, but there's something they don't want you to know." The screen flickered, then displayed a document. "GV003 is not just a clone. He is the final experiment, a being capable of developing independent intelligence and consciousness. If he succeeds, we can achieve immortality." Alexander felt the world spinning around him. Henry laughed. "Do you get it now? You're not just a simple clone. You're the key to immortality." Alexander clenched his fists. "You killed the original to create me." Henry smirked. "We didn't kill him. He sacrificed himself to complete his work." Alexander trembled. Everything he had ever believed was a lie. But before Henry could say more, a loud explosion erupted from outside. Boom! The alarm system blared. A voice came over the intercom. Intrusion. The basement level is under attack. Henry whipped around. What? Alexander smirked. I told you, I didn't come alone. At that moment, James and Claire burst in from a side hallway, guns in hand. Daniel suddenly charged in from behind, tackling 2 guards. The room descended into chaos. Henry drew his gun and aimed it straight at Alexander. You think you can escape from here? Alexander locked eyes with him, a cold smile spreading across his face. Not just escape. He yanked hard at his cuffs, breaking them apart. We're going to destroy Genesis. Gunshots echoed through the frigid hallways of Genesis's headquarters. Alexander dove for cover as a bullet whizzed past his shoulder. Henry Richards stood in the middle of the room, gun in hand, his face twisted with rage. You think you can destroy Genesis? Henry snarled, his weapon trained on Alexander. You're nothing but a bunch of insects. Alexander smirked. Then let's see what a bunch of insects can do. As soon as he finished speaking, Daniel Clark lunged from behind, slamming into Henry's arm and sending him staggering. Bang! The gun flew out of Henry's hand. Claire shouted, We don't have much time. James, have you got the data yet? James was at the central control panel, frantically hacking into the system. Almost there. I need 3 more minutes. They won't give us 3 minutes. Claire shot down a guard charging toward them. Alexander lunged forward and landed a hard punch to Henry's face, but Henry quickly countered, slamming him down to the floor. Who do you think you are, Carter? Henry roared. You're just an experiment, a cheap copy. Alexander clenched his fists, his eyes blazing with fury. I may be a copy, but I'm not your puppet. He swung a powerful punch, this time landing it square in Henry's face, sending him crashing to the ground. Outside the lab, the blaring alarms echoed relentlessly. Daniel stood by the door, peering into the hallway. They're coming. At least 10 armed guys. James shouted. I'm almost done with the data. Just hold them off a little longer. Alexander stood up, grabbing a guard's gun. I'll buy us time. Claire looked at him. Are you crazy? Alexander smirked. Not the first time I've been crazy. He rushed out of the room, firing at the approaching enemies. Pong, pong. 2 soldiers dropped, but there were plenty more. Daniel ran over to assist, taking down 3 more. We can't hold this for long. Alexander tightened his fists. We don't need long, just enough time. Inside the lab, James finally finished downloading the data. Got it, he yelled. Claire quickly checked the USB. All the Genesis data, including the failed experiments, the list of people they killed, and the masterminds behind the Genesis Council. James panted. Then let's get out of here. But at that moment, a barrage of bullets ripped through the window, cursing James's chest. Boom! James collapsed. No! Claire screamed, rushing to catch him. James coughed, blood spilling from his mouth. Go, get out! Alexander turned back, staring at James lying on the floor, his eyes filled with pain. James, don't die here. James gave a weak smile. Don't let my sacrifice be for nothing. His breathing grew faint. Claire gripped his hand tightly. I'm sorry. James closed his eyes. He was gone. With no time to grieve, Alexander pulled Claire to her feet. We have to get out now. Daniel tossed a smoke grenade into the hallway. Run. The 3 of them bolted out, weaving through the dark corridors. Gunshots still rang out behind them. They raced to the warehouse beneath the building where a car was waiting, but as they stepped inside, Stephen Parker stood there, gun in hand, blocking the exit. Claire drew her weapon, but Stephen just laughed. You think I'd let you leave that easily? Alexander narrowed his eyes. What are you doing, Stephen? Kill us and go back to serving Genesis. Stephen smirked. Genesis is finished. I just want a ticket out. He held out his hand. Give me the USB. I'll let you go. Alexander glanced at Claire. She shook her head. No way. Stephen sighed. Then you're forcing me to. Bang! A bullet shot straight through Stephen's head. He crumpled to the ground. Daniel lowered his gun, blowing the smoke from the barrel. I never liked him anyway. Alexander smirked. Thanks. The 3 of them piled into the car. Claire slammed on the gas, and the vehicle sped out of Genesis's headquarters just as the entire building exploded. Boom! Flames erupted, consuming everything. The Genesis Council was finished. 6 months later. Alexander stood on a rooftop in Los Angeles, the sunlight casting down on his face. Beside him, Claire and Daniel stood in silence. "We ended it," Claire whispered. Alexander nodded. "But we lost a lot of people." Daniel crossed his arms. "James wouldn't want us to live in grief." Alexander gave a faint smile. "You're right." He closed his eyes and took a deep breath. For the first time in his life, he felt free. Los Angeles, 3 months after Genesis's collapse. Alexander sat in a small cafe in the heart of the city, his gaze following the flow of people on the street. Genesis had been destroyed, but not all the masterminds behind it had been eliminated. Claire walked in and sat down across from him. "You sure about this?" she asked, her voice laced with doubt. Alexander nodded. "Henry Richards is still alive." Claire frowned. "You saw him buried in the rubble with your own eyes. How could he have survived?" Alexander slid a photo across the table. In it, Henry appeared in Miami, standing next to a group of men in black suits. Claire's eyes widened. "Damn it!" Daniel approached from behind, pulling up a chair and sitting down. "I told you, guys like him don't die that easily." Alexander clenched his fists. Genesis might be gone, but if Henry's alive, he could restart it. Claire sighed. "So, what's the plan?" Alexander smirked. "We hunt him down." The three of them left Los Angeles that night, flying to Miami, where Henry's last known trace had been recorded. As they stepped out of the airport, Daniel pulled Claire aside. "I've got a contact here. He says Henry's working with a group of powerful tycoons to restart Genesis under a new name, Project Rebirth." Claire frowned. "They still won't give up." Alexander tightened his fists. "I won't let that happen." They got into a car and headed straight for a lavish estate on the outskirts of Miami, where Henry was reportedly hiding. Daniel glanced at Alexander. "You sure you want to face him head on?" Alexander smirked. "He owes me an answer." They broke into the estate in the dead of night, slipping through the sprawling hallways. Claire lowered her voice. "We'll split up. Daniel and I will handle the guards. You find Henry." Alexander nodded and made his way toward Henry's office. The door creaked open, and right before his eyes, Henry sat there calmly pouring a glass of whiskey. "Welcome home, GV003, he said, his voice icy. Alexander stepped inside, closing the door behind him. "You're still alive." Henry chuckled softly. Disappointed, Alexander glared at him, his eyes darkening. "No, I'm just thinking of how to end this once and for all." Henry leaned back in his chair, taking a sip of his drink. "You really think you've won, don't you? Genesis was just a small part of a much grander plan." Alexander clenched his fists. "Your project is an abomination, cloning humans to manipulate, to control. Do you really think you're God?" Henry set the glass down, smirking. "You still don't get it, do you, Carter? You're our most perfect creation." Alexander frowned. "Then why do you want to kill me?" Henry's lips curled. "Because you wouldn't submit." Bang! A gunshot rang out. Alexander quickly dodged to the side, the bullet grazing his shoulder. Henry stood up, gun in hand, his eyes glinting with cold resolve. "You really think I didn't know you'd come?" Alexander breathed heavily, blood seeping from the wound. But he didn't back down. "Then did you know about this?" he said, tossing a small device toward Henry. The device landed on the table, glowing. Beep, beep. Henry's eyes widened. "What?" Boom! A surge of electromagnetic energy burst out, disabling the entire security system in the mansion. At that moment, Claire and Daniel burst in, guns drawn. Henry stumbled back, his face paling. "You!" Alexander stepped forward, his gun aimed squarely at Henry's forehead. "It's over, Henry." Henry gave a faint laugh, but desperation flickered in his eyes. "You really think killing me will change anything, Carter?" he said. "Genesis may be destroyed, but its ideals live on. There will always be people who want to continue this experiment." Alexander tightened his grip on the gun. "Then I'll make sure no one can ever continue it again." Henry sneered. "Then kill me. Do you have the guts?" Alexander stared at him, his hand trembling slightly. Claire spoke up. "Alexander, don't let him manipulate you." Daniel crossed his arms, saying coldly, "We don't need to kill him. We've got a much better option." Alexander frowned. "What option?" Daniel smirked. "Hand him over to Interpol." Henry froze. "No, you can't do that." Claire smirked. "Why not?" Letting the whole world know about Genesis's crimes, that's what you fear most, isn't it? Henry's face turned ashen. Alexander leaned down, whispering in his ear. It's over, Henry. Daniel tied him up tightly, and this time there was no escape for him. 2 weeks later, Henry was brought to trial, along with all the evidence about Genesis. The world was shaken. Project Genesis was completely eradicated. Claire stood beside Alexander as they watched the trial unfold on the TV screen. Daniel crossed his arms. It's finally over. Alexander took a deep breath. No. Now it's the beginning of a new life. Claire smiled. You're truly free now, Alexander. Alexander closed his eyes, breathing in the fresh air. For the first time in his life, he felt like he truly existed. Los Angeles, 2 months after Henry Richards' arrest. That morning, Alexander stood on the hotel balcony, gazing down at the bustling streets below. Today was Henry's sentencing, the last remaining member of the Genesis Council. Claire walked into the room holding a newspaper. Have you seen the news? Alexander took it, glancing at the bold headline. Genesis crimes exposed. Henry Richards faces life in prison. He let out a breath. Finally, he can't escape. Claire crossed her arms. But we need to make sure he has no way to turn this around. Alexander nodded. We'll go to the courthouse. I want to see him sentenced with my own eyes. 3 hours later, at the Los Angeles International Courthouse, the courtroom was packed with reporters, lawyers, and witnesses. Henry was escorted in, wearing an orange prisoner's uniform. Despite the handcuffs, he still carried his usual air of arrogance. The judge spoke. Defendant Henry Richards, you are charged with human rights violations, conducting unethical experiments on humans, and conspiring to cover up the crimes of the Genesis organization. Do you have anything to say? Henry gave a faint smile. I just want to say, you've all made a huge mistake. The courtroom buzzed with murmurs. Alexander clenched his fists. He's trying to pull something again. The judge banged the gavel. Order. Henry continued. Genesis wasn't just an organization. It was an idea, a scientific revolution. You can destroy us, but sooner or later, someone else will carry on our work. Alexander shot to his feet. You're wrong, Henry. Genesis is dead, and this time, no one can save you. Henry turned to look at Alexander, his eyes dripping with mockery. You really think so, GV003. Alexander tightened his fists. My name is Alexander Carter, and I'm not your puppet anymore. The judge spoke up. Defendant, you no longer have the floor. The court has reached its decision. The room grew tense. The judge declared firmly. The court sentences Henry Richards to life imprisonment without parole. The courtroom erupted with applause and cheers. Claire smiled, giving Alexander a light punch on the shoulder. We did it. Daniel nodded. He'll never get out of that prison. Alexander exhaled. At last. Genesis was truly finished. 3 weeks later, Alexander, Claire, and Daniel met up at a small bar in Los Angeles. Claire raised her glass. To freedom. Daniel smirked. To finally being able to breathe easy. Alexander took a sip of his drink, gazing out the window. Can we really forget it all? Claire set her glass down, looking at him seriously. No one's saying you have to forget, but you have the right to start over. Daniel nodded. Genesis stole our past. Don't let it take our future, too. Alexander stayed silent. Then he gave a faint smile. Maybe you guys are right. Just as they were about to leave the bar, a stranger approached. The man wore a long coat, his face hidden beneath a hood. Alexander Carter. His voice was low and raspy. Alexander tensed, wary. Who are you? The man pulled back his hood, and Alexander froze. He had a face identical to his own. Claire gasped sharply. No way. GV001. Daniel narrowed his eyes. He was supposed to be dead long ago. The man smirked faintly. Not that easy. Alexander stood up, staring at him. I thought you'd gone missing. GV001, the first subject of the Genesis experiment, locked eyes with Alexander. Genesis might be over, but the truth about us, it's far from finished. His words sent a shiver down Alexander's spine. Alexander, Claire, and Daniel stepped out of the bar, facing GV001. Alexander clenched his fists. What do you want? GV001 looked at him, his gaze icy. I just want to remind you of something. Alexander frowned. GV001 leaned in, whispering into his ear. Do you really think we're the last copies? Alexander's heart seemed to stop. GV001 stepped back, a smirk tugging at his lips. Enjoy your life, Carter. But don't forget we're not the only ones. With that, he turned and walked away, blending into the crowd on the street. Claire looked at Alexander, her voice low. Do you think he's telling the truth? Alexander took a deep breath, a spark of resolve flashing in his eyes. If there's anyone else out there, I'll find them. Daniel gave a dry laugh. Then I'm with you. This time, we won't leave anyone from Genesis standing. Claire sighed, but then nodded. A new fight starting, isn't it? Alexander looked up at the Los Angeles night sky, his eyes no longer filled with fear. It's not a fight anymore, he said. This time, we take control of our own fate. The story of Genesis isn't just a battle against those who manipulate science. It's also a journey to find identity and freedom. Alexander, once an anonymous copy, overcame the fate imposed on him, proving that people aren't defined by their past, but by their choices. The story also warns of the dark side of science. When ethics are cast aside for ambition, ultimately it teaches that justice may come late, but it cannot be extinguished, and only those who dare to face the truth can truly be free.